"You will never leave me," Mountain Man growled at his sobbing fat wife, his desperate truth. "You will never leave me," he said, his voice cracking like thunder against the mountain walls. The words were not shouted. They were pleaded, raw and trembling with desperation. But to the terrified woman lying weakly in the bed, they sounded like a death sentence. Prudence Nightingale stared at the man in the blood-stained white coat, standing over her. The metallic scent of medicine and storm filled the air. Lightning flashed across the windows of the stone fortress high atop Eternal Peak. She had heard the stories. The reclusive doctor who lived among the clouds, who cut open corpses to study the mystery of death, who was said to keep his patients locked away until they drew their last breath. And now she was his wife. Only hours earlier her family had stood before him, begging for mercy. "She has 1 year at most," another physician had said. "There is nothing to be done." But Dr. Solomon Grimhart had stepped forward, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of the candlelight. "There is a way," he'd said, "but the treatment is experimental and dangerous. If I do this, she becomes my patient. Entirely." Her father had nodded before she could protest. Her fate was sealed with ink and trembling signatures. Now, beneath the humming of strange machines, Sol looked down at her with eyes too human to be called cruel, and yet too haunted to be kind. "You will never leave me," he repeated, and as the storm raged outside, Prudence felt the chill of both salvation and captivity wrap around her heart. Little did she know, those words were not a threat. They were a promise. The fortress on Eternal Peak did not feel like a home. It felt like a mausoleum built for the living. When Prudence first arrived, snow was falling in thick, soundless flakes, blanketing the stone steps that led up to the great iron doors. Inside, the halls were lined with shelves of glass jars filled with organs suspended in liquid, books stacked to the ceiling, and instruments whose purpose she could only guess. The air smelled of alcohol, iron, and something faintly floral, perhaps lavender, a scent that tried and failed to mask decay. Solomon Grimhart said little. His every movement was precise, his every word measured. He wrote constantly on charts and journals, on scraps of paper pinned to the walls. Sometimes he muttered to himself, as if debating with ghosts only he could see. Prue, trembling, watched him from her hospital bed. Her wrists still bore faint bruises from the straps the other doctors had used to restrain her during her final seizures. She thought of those words again. "You will never leave me." Was she now his patient, or his prisoner? He fed her a thick, bitter tonic every morning. It burned her throat, left her dizzy, but afterward the pain in her chest eased a little. Once, when she dropped the glass and it shattered, she flinched, expecting anger. Instead, Sewell silently swept up the shards, knelt, and checked her feet for cuts. "Don't move," he said, voice low but trembling. "You're not strong enough to bleed." That night, she woke to find him asleep in the chair beside her bed, head bowed, his hand still resting near hers on the blanket. She had never seen a man sleep like that, half guard, half grief. Days turned into weeks. The strange treatments continued, blood draws, injections, bitter herbs that smelled of fire and metal. The pain came in waves, and each time she thought she'd die, Sewell was there, whispering to her as if to will her soul to stay. "I will not let death take you," he said once, his voice cracking like something inside him was breaking. "Not again." When she asked, "Again?" he turned away, jaw tightening. In the following days, she began to notice things. A locket on his desk with a woman's portrait inside, a wedding ring he still wore, medical note signed with another name, Eleanor Grimhart. The name echoed in her dreams. Then one night, during a fevered delirium, she woke to find Saul sitting by her side, staring into the fire. "She had your eyes," he said softly. "My wife. She died from the same disease." The truth settled like snow, cold, silent, final. Sewell was not her captor. He was a man haunted by failure, consumed by guilt, and desperate to rewrite the ending that had destroyed him once before. For the first time, Prue saw the grief behind the brilliance, the loneliness that no discovery could cure, and though she still feared him, something inside her, something fragile and human, began to shift. She realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't trapped here to die. She was trapped here because someone refused to let her. The days on Eternal Peak blurred into one another, snow, silence, medicine, and pain. Yet, within that strange, suspended world, something began to change. At first, Prudence counted time by her heartbeat, wondering which one would be her last. But gradually, under Saul's relentless care, she began to feel moments of reprieve. Her breathing eased, her strength returned, if only in flickers. Saul kept a rigid routine. At dawn, he climbed to the ridge to collect snow for distilled water. At noon, he worked in the laboratory, his shadow moving behind frosted glass. And at night, when the storms rolled in, he read aloud from his journals, complex formulas and chemical equations mixed with the occasional line of poetry. One evening, during a rare moment of calm, she asked, "Why poetry, Doctor?" He looked up from his notes. "Because the body obeys science," he said, "but the soul needs art." The words hung between them, strange and fragile. Sometimes, when her fever worsened, Sewell would sit beside her bed and place his hand on her wrist, silently counting her pulse. His touch was clinical, yet trembling. His gaze, sharp, analytical, softened each time she flinched. When she whispered once, "I'm sorry for being weak," he stopped writing entirely. "Don't ever apologize for surviving," he said quietly. During one of his rare trips into the nearby village for supplies, Prue wandered into the greenhouse attached to the laboratory, a humid sanctuary glowing under glass. Inside, hundreds of herbs and rare flowers thrived in careful order. Each plant bore a label in his precise handwriting, but there, at the very center, was one pot without a name, a single pale bloom bent toward the light, trembling. When Sewell returned and saw her there, his face went pale. "Don't touch that one," he warned. "Why?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then sighed. "Because it only blooms when it's dying." That night, while lightning crawled over the mountains, he worked without rest. She could hear him through the door, glass breaking, metal clanging, his voice muttering in half-mad determination. "Not again," he whispered, "not again." When dawn came, he staggered into her room, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling around a vial of clear liquid. "Drink this," he said. She hesitated. "What is it?" "Hope," he answered simply. The serum burned through her veins like fire. Pain racked her body. She screamed until her voice broke. Sewell held her down, tears streaking through the soot on his face. "Stay with me, Prue. Please, stay." And then, silence. Her heart stopped. Sewell froze. For an endless second, the world seemed to collapse in on itself. He pressed his ear to her chest, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken in decades. And then, A heartbeat, faint, fragile, but there. He sank to his knees, shaking. "You stubborn, impossible woman." When Prue opened her eyes hours later, she found him asleep beside her bed again, his head resting on his folded arms. The sunlight painted streaks across his gray hair. She reached out, brushing a trembling hand against his. In that moment, she realized she no longer feared him. The man who had once terrified her now looked more like a soldier who had fought too many wars and finally won one. From that day on, something changed in both of them. Sewell no longer barked orders. He asked, he explained, he listened, and Prue began to smile again, tentatively, then genuinely. The mountain still howled with winter storms, but inside the fortress there was warmth, of fire, of laughter, and of two souls learning that love could bloom even in a place built for science and sorrow. Spring came late to Eternal Peak. When the first snowmelt trickled through the stone gutters, Prudence stepped outside for the first time in months. The sunlight felt foreign on her skin, warm, almost unreal. She lifted her face to it and closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she forgot the hospital bed, the injections, the pain. She was simply alive. From the balcony above, Solomon watched her quietly. He had been the one to coax her outside, though he hadn't followed. The way his eyes softened when she smiled was not the gaze of a scientist observing his experiment. It was the gaze of a man watching a miracle. Inside the fortress, their days found rhythm. Saul's laboratory remained his domain of glass and steel, but Prue claimed the kitchen and the greenhouse. She began cooking simple meals: broth, bread, tea with honey. The first time she made soup, Saul burned his tongue because he couldn't wait for it to cool. She laughed until she coughed, and he panicked, checking her pulse like a man possessed. "Stop fussing," she said, swatting his hand. "I'm not glass." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You're more precious than glass." The word stunned her. It was the first time he had said something that wasn't clinical or controlled. And after that day, it became easier. They talked about the patients he'd lost, about her fear of dying, about his first wife, Eleanor, who had taught him to read poetry because, as she'd said, medicine without mercy is just another kind of cruelty. Prue tended the greenhouse every morning, whispering to the plants as if they could hear her. Saul teased her about it, but he noticed something. Plants that had struggled under his care now thrived. When she asked why he kept so many dying specimens, he answered simply, "Because I can't bear to give up on anything that still fights to live." One evening, when her energy was low and the fever threatened to return, she found him in the lab, staring into a microscope. "You look tired," she said gently. "You should rest." He didn't look up. "I rest when death does." She walked closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then you'll never rest. You can't fight it forever." He turned toward her, his eyes shadowed but soft. "I'm not fighting death anymore, Prue. I'm fighting for you." In that moment, the room seemed to still. The machines clicked, the lamps hummed, but between them there was silence, heavy, unspoken, sacred. That night, when another coughing fit shook her, he didn't fetch instruments or needles. He simply held her. For the first time, he didn't look afraid of losing her. He looked determined to stay with her, no matter what came. Days later, she returned the gesture. He had been working for 16 hours straight, his hands trembling, exhaustion darkening his eyes. She appeared in the doorway holding a cup of tea. "You save everyone else," she said, placing it before him. Who saves you?" He froze, unable to answer. She smiled. "Then let me." From that day forward, she became part of his work. She organized his notes, labeled vials, and even helped him refine his formulas. But between their tasks, there were moments that no medicine could measure. Shared laughter over spilled chemicals, arguments about dosage that ended in teasing, the quiet comfort of two souls bound by the same fire. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled through the mountain. The power flickered, the candles went out, and the fortress plunged into darkness. Prue gasped when a thunderclap shook the windows. Then, in the pitch black, Saul's voice, "It's all right. I'm here." She felt his hand find hers, warm and certain, and though the storm raged outside, she realized she was no longer afraid of thunder, of illness, of the man who had once terrified her, because now she understood what he meant that night. When he said, "You will never leave me," he hadn't been claiming her. He had been begging the world not to take her away, and in that dark, echoing fortress, lit only by flashes of lightning, Prudence Nightingale made herself a silent promise. If he was fighting for her life, then she would fight for his heart. Peace is a fragile thing. On Eternal Peak, it lasted exactly 3 months. By late summer, the snow had melted from the slopes, and messengers began climbing the trail again. Men from the medical council, scholars, and finally, the officials who had once called Solomon a genius before calling him mad. They came demanding answers. "Dr. Grimhart," one of them barked, standing in the doorway of the fortress, "you've been absent from the university for 2 years. There are rumors about experiments on humans, about resurrection." Sewell's face hardened. "Rumors spread faster than truth. You've climbed the wrong mountain." But they didn't leave. They searched, scribbled notes, and questioned Prue. She stood pale and trembling as they asked whether she'd been subjected to his procedures. "No," she said quietly, her hands clasped behind her back. "He saved me. He gave me life." They didn't believe her. That night, when the visitors finally left, Prue found Saul sitting alone in the laboratory, the firelight flickering over his face. He was staring at a single vial of her blood. "They'll come back," he said flatly. "They'll call me a fraud, or worse, a monster, and they'll call you proof." "Then let them," she whispered. "We have nothing to hide." His jaw tightened. "You think they care about truth? They care about control. If they can't claim the cure, they'll destroy it." For the first time since she'd met him, Prue saw something in his eyes that frightened her more than the illness ever had. Hopelessness. Over the next few days, Sewell became withdrawn. He locked his research journals away and stopped letting her assist in his work. When she asked why, he snapped, "Because if they come for me, I won't let them take you too." "But I'm not a child to protect," she argued, his voice cracked. "You are everything I couldn't save before." The words hit like lightning. That night, while he slept at his desk, Prue crept into his private study. Inside, she found files, old patient records, diagrams, photographs of a woman who looked so much like her that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Eleanor Grimhart, his late wife, dead at 23 from the same disease. In the margins of the file, Sewell had written a single phrase over and over, "Not again." When Sewell woke and found her reading it, the silence between them was suffocating. "You kept this from me," she whispered. "You never wanted to save me. You wanted to save her." He stepped toward her, his voice shaking. "At first, yes. I thought if I could cure you, I could rewrite the past. But that's not what this became. Her tears fell hot and fast. Then what am I, Solomon? A patient? A ghost of someone you couldn't let go? He reached for her, but she stepped back. You're the reason I still believe in life, he said hoarsely. I failed Eleanor because I didn't love her enough to defy death. I won't fail you the same way. Then stop treating me like a cure, she whispered, and start seeing me as a woman. For the first time, he had no words. That night, she slept alone in the greenhouse, surrounded by the plants she'd saved. When dawn came, Sewell found her there, curled beneath a blanket, her breath slow and steady. He didn't wake her. He just knelt beside her and whispered to the flowers, "She's right." From that day, something changed again, not a breaking, but a shift. Sewell began sharing everything, his research, his fears, his failures. And Prue, in turn, began sharing her strength. But beyond the mountain, rumors kept spreading. Wealthy investors and greedy scientists wanted Saul's discovery. Some whispered that the cure could make them immortal. Others said he'd gone too far, that God would not allow such defiance. And soon, one of those men would climb the mountain, not for truth, but for power. And the peace they had built on Eternal Peak would face its fiercest test yet. The storm that night was not made of snow or rain. It was made of men. By dusk, torches flickered along the mountain road, shadows moving through fog, the metallic glint of rifles beneath their cloaks. Prue saw them first from the balcony. "Saul," she whispered, voice trembling, "they're coming." He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. "The council," he murmured, "and their investors." Within minutes, he had locked every door and shuttered every window. The fortress, once a sanctuary, became a citadel. When the first knock came, it was polite. The second was a command. The third was the sound of a rifle butt cracking wood. "Dr. Grimhart," a voice bellowed through the storm, "open up. By royal decree, you are under arrest for crimes against nature." Prue grabbed his arm. "We have to leave." He shook his head. "If I run, they'll destroy everything. The research, the cure, everything we built." She stared at him, tears welling. "Then let them take me. You can still start over." His voice turned to steel. "Never, I told you, you will never leave me. Not to them, not to death." He opened a drawer, pulling out a single journal, the one that contained his life's work, and handed it to her. "If anything happens to me, you run to the southern ridge. There's a hidden path down the valley. You keep this safe." She clutched it to her chest. "I won't go without you." The door exploded inward. Armed men stormed in, scientists, soldiers, opportunists. One stepped forward, his cloak marked with the royal seal. "Dr. Grimhart, surrender your research. The crown demands it." Saul stood tall, his figure framed by lightning flashing behind the windows. "The crown didn't earn this cure," he said coldly. "It was born from love, not greed." The man sneered. "Love doesn't change the laws of life and death." Prue stepped forward before Saul could stop her. "No, but compassion does. And that's something your kind will never understand." A shot rang out. The sound was deafening. Saul staggered, falling to one knee. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, blood blooming dark against his white coat. "Saul!" Prue screamed, dropping beside him. He caught her hand, gripping it tight. "Go!" he gasped. "Now." But she didn't. She stood, fury burning through her fear. "You call yourselves men of science," she shouted at them, "but all you know is how to destroy." Before they could fire again, lightning struck the fortress tower. The blast shook the mountain, throwing everyone to the ground. Smoke and fire roared through the hall. When the soldiers fled in panic, Prue dragged Sewell into the storm, clutching his bloodied hand. Together, they stumbled toward the southern ridge, the journal pressed to her chest, the fire at their backs lighting the sky like dawn. And as the fortress burned, Solomon looked back once, not at the flames, but at the life he was leaving behind. Then he turned to Prue, his voice raw but steady. "You were my cure all along." She held his face in trembling hands. "And you were my reason to live." They disappeared into the night, two silhouettes against the fire. Fugitives, survivors, lovers bound by something stronger than death. The valley below Eternal Peak was silent when dawn came. The fire that devoured the fortress had faded into a black scar against the sky. Smoke drifted like ghosts through the trees, but life still breathed beneath it. Sewell and Prue collapsed near a frozen stream, their hands still intertwined. His wound was deep, but not fatal. Her trembling fingers tore strips from her cloak, binding his shoulder while whispering through her tears, "You're not allowed to die, not after everything we've survived." He smiled weakly. "You sound like me now." They stayed hidden for weeks in a shepherd's cabin at the edge of the valley. Prue tended the fire, grew herbs, and mixed medicine the way he had taught her. Sewell's recovery was slow, but for the first time he wasn't the doctor, he was the patient, and she refused to let him give up. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, he sat beside her by the fire, his arm still in a sling. "I used to think keeping you alive was the only way to love you," he said softly, "but I was wrong. Love isn't about refusing to let go. It's about having something worth holding on to." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you gave me that?" He smiled, the kind of smile she'd never seen from him before, unburdened, human, peaceful. "You saved me from my own obsession, Prue. You showed me that living is more than surviving." The flames crackled between them, casting their shadows on the cabin wall. Outside, the first snow of a new winter began to fall. "You will never leave me," he whispered again. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a promise. Every story of love is, in truth, a story of survival. Solomon fought death. Prudence fought despair. But in the end, they didn't just win against time. They learned how to live within it. Their vow, "You will never leave me," was never about possession. It was about choosing every day to stay, to love, to heal, to begin again. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether in the quiet of your room or beneath your own mountain sky, remember this: love doesn't conquer death by avoiding it. It conquers death by making every heartbeat worth living for. Do you still believe in forever?